Check, check, check. Let's go. What's up? What's up, y'all? What's up? Let's go. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. Hopefully I'm good. Let's get this moved over here a little. And that should be good. Oh, I just realized the fan's a little too loud. Yo, what's up, everybody? Today we're covering Herman Hesse's Steppenwolf. So this is the 1927 novel by the Nobel Prize winning, Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize for Literature winning author, German author, Herman Hesse. And shouts out already to Amy. Shouts out to Amy for that $20 and let's see, what'd she send? Let's see. She sent $20.23 PayPal. Appreciate you. Thank you so much out there. Thank you, Amy. And also, shouts out to, I just saw another one. Shouts out to Jason, our homeboy Jason out there for, I think, that $5 PayPal that I just saw and now it disappeared. So, yo, thank you all for supporting me so much. If you want to smash the like, share the stream, share it with your family and friends, put it on social media wherever you can. And just share my channel in general. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And if you want to donate, that's wonderful. I really appreciate that so much. Let's get into it, y'all. Let's get after it. Let's get after it. So today we're covering Herman Hesse's Steppenwolf. I keep looking at this other book that I just started, which is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the novelization of the film. And of course, that was a sponsored stream, so we're going to do that next. But today we're just going into modern literature, modernism and the modernist movement with Herman Hesse. I just read Beneath the Wheel by Herman Hesse. And I considered covering that, but I thought I would just get to the sort of classic Hesse and do Steppenwolf. I first read this book in 2000 when I was, I just picked it up and read it. I think I was it was spring of my first year in college. I was in Memphis, and book had a big impact on me. And it's interesting going back and rereading it, you know, in my old age, all these years later, and re-remembering what I'd read, and also looking at it from a completely different, not completely different worldview, but a different perspective, especially because the main character in the book is Harry Haller. And Harry Haller is his name. Yes. Harry Haller, not Herman Hesse, Harry Haller. And yes, he also wrote Siddhartha. Yes. Very good. Amtown. He wrote Siddhartha. I read a bunch of Hesse. You guys may have read this. Of course, everybody knows the name of the book from the Boomer Band, but we're not talking about the Boomer Band today. We're talking about the great classic work of literature, Steppenwolf. And this book is especially big for, shouts out to my sister out there, and to Jerry, our homeboy Jerry out there, who had an awesome interview over on his channel, Exposing Powerful Lies, live streams the other day with Chase Haggard. That was a great interview. Go back and rewatch that. I'm sure everybody's seen it. It's getting some nice numbers and some big traction, and as it should, and as it would with our homeboy Jerry. So, but the book is about an angry young man, and one thing that I really noticed this time around in reading it is that, Toledo, is the emphasis on D.I.D, BPD, and what he calls in the book schizomania, which of course I didn't really, as a 20-year-old in 2000, that didn't really play a big part. The part that really affected me was, this lone wolf's, he's the Steppenwolf, so we can say that. And he actually mentions the phrase lone wolf in it. He is the lone wolf, angry young man. You don't have to be an angry young man to read this. You can be a young man coming from an idyllic childhood. But the things that occur in your late teenage years and in your early 20s. But, of course, Harry Haller, the Steppenwolf, is not a young man. The narrator of the book, or the speaker in the first part of the book, is a young man talking about this character, the Steppenwolf. But the Steppenwolf himself is 47 or 48 years old. He talks about his youth, and that's part of the book. And his, you could, I guess, on a surface level, call this the journey of self-discovery, but it's much more than that. And in fact, it is a journey through the psyche, through the mind and trying to discover who he is. There's a dichotomy. There's a bunch of divisions in the book. There's a dichotomy there's a dualistic Gnostic dichotomy that is blatant in the book, and there's also the dichotomy between the artist and the bourgeois mentality, between the old world and between the world of modernity, which the book's published in 27. So this is 2 years after T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. It's right after The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald. It's after Ezra Pound. But there's a lot in the book. I found many references in the book to it. In a way, it takes the form of a kind of a solo Dante's Inferno, or even a Poe's Mask of the Red Death, or the Decameron, because you're going to be interested to find some of the allusions in the book, especially the ones that refer to Eyes Wide Shut parties, the Traum novel, right? The Trauma novel by Schnitzler, the Mask of the Red Death, basically the masked ball. And although it is a solo journey through the inferno of the self, it takes the form of a kind of journey, a kind of a spiritual journey of reflection. The mirrors are mentioned throughout, and his personalities also will play a part in this, because his various personae, as Ezra Pound called them, the personae, right? Persona means mask. But really, my sister says Duke enjoyed his 15 seconds of fame. Yes, shouts out to my little baby down there, my sister's dog Duke. So, yes, definitely Mask of the Red Death vibes, because the character will go into something called the Magic Theater, and it's advertised as for madmen only. You also may be interested to know, because it plays a role in a lot of the areas that we're involved in our sort of circles here, and especially JD's globalist book series, because he's covered, of course, Between Two Ages by Z-Big, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Between Two Ages. And the book title of that comes from Steppenwolf. You may be interested to know. You may have already known that, but we're going to get to what that means to be between two ages, not in the Z-Big sense of the Technotronic era, but in the sense of the self and where the character in this finds himself, and what he's interested in. And also not every, but it's sort of the archetypal young man that this is the rite of passage that occurs continuously throughout the ages. So let me turn the fan down real quick, and then we'll get started. Okay, there we go. A little bit less interference there, and let's get started. So, again, the book was published in 1927 by Herman Hesse, and the introduction states a couple of interesting things. First of all, I was interested in the fact that he, on a personal level, that he went to Tübingen. He was in Tübingen for university, and that's interesting to me, because when I was story time, y'all. When I was traveling through Europe on an interrail pass through the continent, this is my third year of university, my final year of university, when I was in Northern Ireland, and I went to Europe the second time on a long trip, where I was basically I flew into Zurich, and then I went through Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, Liechtenstein, and Germany. But when I was in where was I? I just left Interlaken, I think, and then I went to Vienna and met up with, I was in Vienna, and I met up with my old college friend from America, Jim, and we went through Baden-Baden, and we went through the Schwarzwald and the Black Forest, and we were walking. I was walking a lot. I was on foot a lot, and then taking trains, and we actually, when we were in Vienna, we went to this is really weird, kind of Schnitzler vibes here. We sort of found ourselves at like this weird private chamber music ballet party for these sophistos, and then afterwards we went out, and the ballet dancer was beautiful, and then afterwards we went out to the pub with the ballet dancers and party through the night. And then we had to get on the night train. I had to get on the night train and go to, I think I headed to Denmark after that. And I went to the island of Moon in Denmark, which was its own separate journey. But anyway, in the middle of that, went to where Jim was studying at Tübingen University. So that was just a little bit of a personal level connection with this. But Hesse Hesse was a hypersensitive, I can relate, hypersensitive, imaginative, lively, and extremely headstrong child. Hesse proved to be a constant source of despair and annoyance to his parents and his teachers. That's probably pretty common. And ended up in Tübingen. He was married, but spent a long time in his life solo, and wrote some of his best novels basically in a common boarding house. Let's see. This says, his wife was committed. This is just some background information on Hesse. Not that it has much to do. I like to draw a distinction, of course, as we've said many times, between the character and the book. But there's an obvious character connection and a journey of self-discovery here between Harry Haller and Herman Hesse, right? But once the writer puts pen to page, it becomes the character. But he did have his wife committed, just like the psychotic Frost that we covered in the Frost analysis that we did a long time ago. Let's see. Siddhartha was published. Hesse's Buddha-like search for the basic unity and meaningfulness of life, begun in the closing months of 1919, was finally finished and published in 1922. Important year in the artistic modernist era. And then it says, Hesse wallowed in despair but lived in faith, a faith in the ultimate meaningfulness of life. A lot of the people see this book as one of a dark and bleak book about despair and degradation. And there's certainly there are a few eyes wide shut and depraved things that happen. There's drug taking in the book. There's a lot of, there's things in the book. But it's ultimately one of a person coming to terms with himself and striving for truth, purity, and innocence, and ultimately salvation. Now, he gets there in I would say, a pretty Gnostic way. The book is almost exclusively Gnostic in terms of its worldview. It's kind of a bold statement, but I think you could boil it down to that. He says, this says on the introduction, page 13. I picked up this book, by the way, in New Orleans at Barcadia, which is, by the way, the only reason one has to be in this place, right? I'll have a J&B straight and a Corona. No, that's Texarkana. But remember, he's supposed to go to, in American Psycho, he's supposed to take her to Dorsia, but they end up at Barcadia. But we went to the Arcadia or Arcadian bookstore in New Orleans, and I got this book for like, I don't know, $2 or something. And it's almost completely fallen apart while I'm reading it. I had another copy of it way back when, and that's the copy that I can't find. But anyway, this says, our era for him was for him one of moral depravity and intellectual mediocrity, of surface glitter, snug comfort, sham conventionality, and foolish optimism. It is a materialistic age where science has become a religion, and the final criterion of value is function. Man has lost his soul in this world of money, machines, and distrust. Pretty revelatory, right? We can relate to this. It's a pretty clear statement on the post-Enlightenment leading through the Victorian era into the modern age, into the artistic modernity, then into postmodernism, and finally into this kind of post-Big Nine event, Great Reset era that we find ourselves in, and things really haven't changed. It's the same sense, we get the same sense of ennui, right, fear and loathing because of what this guy just said. It's very relatable. I hate to say very, it's relatable. He says he has exchanged his spiritual peace for physical comfort, for his bourgeois comfort. Man is, it says, with his imagination stunted and his feelings stifled, he no longer appreciates beauty, nor is he capable of real artistic creation, right? Incapable of appreciating beauty. A thing of beauty is a joy forever, says John Keats. Right, truth, beauty, and goodness. All vital rapport with God and nature has been lost in the modernist landscape. Reason has supplanted faith, and society has forgotten the individual. The middle class core of our civilization never ceased to be the butt of Hesse's ire. The bourgeois represents all that is negative, a stalwart and stodgy non-entity. He is governed in all his ideals and pursuits solely by the impulse of self-preservation. He is the characterless Philistine who epitomizes mediocrity, cowardice, compromise, irresponsibility, and servility. He is the strapping, insensitive physical specimen who enjoys health and wealth but lacks all culture. It is to him that the world belongs, while the sensitive worshippers of beauty and the earnest seekers after truth and the meaning of life are misfits and outcasts. One thing that's, excuse me, folks, one thing that I found interesting in this is that Hesse's books were burned during the Hortler regime, which followed the publication of this book, right, 1933 onwards. But he was never banned. In other words, that particular era, with the black shirts, tended to find some sort of identification with Hesse, but also found some of his ideas repugnant. This says his popularity in Germany began to wane with the rise of Hitler. Hesse had become a Swiss citizen in 1923, and because he refrained from any public pronouncement of his otherwise obvious antipathy towards that government, his name never was put on the official blacklist of undesirable authors. His books, however, were tacitly banned and began to appear in ever-decreasing numbers. But then, of course, he was received the Nobel Prize in 1946, Nobel Prize for Literature. Let's see. Yes, 1946. He resorted to fantasy and withdrew into the realm of beauty there to indulge in the extremes of late 19th century aestheticism. Of course, this is the 20th century, but the sort of ideals of 19th century aestheticism. I found many parallels in this book. This is one of the reasons why I liked it, especially when I was 20, because there are obvious parallels in the book between Rimbaud and A Season in Hell and the Steppenwolf. And the sort of hellish journey of discovery, right? It's like Stewie said in Family Guy. I'm not going to do a Stewie impression, but he says basically, I want to change my name to something like Dax or Dexter or Maximilian, something with an X, and go to Europe and find myself, right? Which is an excellent parody and a satire of reality, and something that I did not with that intention, right? But I do think that that's important for, that's a great privilege for people if they can do that, to go see the world. This says a corresponding change took place in Hesse's art. While the spirit-flesh dichotomy continued to be the vital issue in this world of thought, it was no longer the acutely personal problem it had once been. That's what he says at the end of A Season in Hell. He says, I'm sure that that we have one body and one soul in that poem. This says, let's see. In keeping with the new adjustment of life and more dispassionate attitude toward what he regarded as its basic problem, Hesse's once explosive inspiration became more disciplined and his creative activity less impulsive and also less prolific. His art came to reflect the slower and more orderly tempo his life assumed, less dramatic in its tensions, in its now expansive nature, and much more given to its narrative. The atmosphere is less charged, the language is less constrained, the vocabulary is marked more than ever by a poetic simplicity, while syntax becomes more playfully involved in symbolism ever more prevalent and profoundly enigmatic. In all three of his last tales, a romantic spirit again prevails, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. And then finally, that was a statement on form, on the form of his writing. Form in terms of his prose form. The final page of this introduction says, it is perhaps only in Siddhartha and a few other books, that Hesse managed to extricate himself sufficiently from this engrossment with its own immediate personal problems to enable him to mold his art with that care necessary to ensure it beyond any doubt against the wear of time, and to give it some of the more universal implications inherent in all truly great art. Steppenwolf, however, will remain one of Hesse's most gripping and most fascinating documents of the times, for Haller's sickness of the soul is not the eccentricity of a single individual, but the sickness of the times themselves, the neurosis of that generation to which Haller belongs, a sickness, it seems, that by no means attacks the weak and worthless only, but rather precisely those who are strongest in spirit and richest in gifts. And again, this is emblematic of the modernist era, because, of course, the defining event in terms of modernity and the modernist artistic movements, apart from the obvious artistic signposts of the time, like the Armory exhibition, right, or the or Hotler's art exhibition on depraved art, right, some of these other like sort of monolithic events. The great global defining event was, of course, the Great War, 1914 and 1918, and we'll see that Haller is a veteran of the war, or at least it seems so, and he experiences not just he doesn't experience the trench warfare that we get as an echo in terms of something that's alluded to, like in, for instance, The Wasteland, or in Fitzgerald's writing, something that wholly affected the Lost Generation and so forth. But really, this is a Eurocentric attitude, and one where he experiences brutal killing and just absolute murder on a personal level, at least in the book Steppenwolf, right? Let's see. My note here says, sickness of the soul, bourgeoisie values, postmodernism, modernity, sickness of the times, the quasi-anti-esprit of the age. Okay, so let's get into it. So the book begins. The book is essentially a novel within a novel. And the preface says, the book contains the records left us by a man whom, according to the expression he often used himself, was called the Steppenwolf. Whether this manuscript needs any introductory remarks may be open to question. I, however, feel the need of adding a few pages to those of the Steppenwolf, in which I try to record my recollections of him. What I know of him is little enough. Indeed, of his past life and origins, I know nothing at all. Yet the impression left by his personality has remained, in spite of all, a deep and sympathetic one. Some years ago, the Steppenwolf, who was then approaching 50, he's 47 or 48, called on my aunt to inquire for a furnished room. He took the attic room on the top floor, the bedroom next to it, returned a day or two later with 2 trunks and a big case of books, and stayed 9 or 10 months. He lived there. On page 5, the description of the Steppenwolf: he wore a fashionable and comfortable winter overcoat, and he was well enough, though carelessly dressed, clean-shaven, and his cropped head showed here and there a streak of gray. He carried himself in a way I did not at all like at first. There was something weary and undecided about it that did not go with his keen and striking profile, nor with the tone of his voice. He had a peculiar smile. Altogether, he gave the impression of having come out of an alien world, which is important because, again, this is the archetype of the other. This is the stranger. This is Camus' L'Étranger, right? This is Rimbaud's I is an other. And that will also play a role in the book, because the Steppenwolf himself talks about how he has personalities at war within himself. And he later says that he is a schizo, or a schizomaniac. I think now we would call this BPD, D.I.D, or at least post-traumatic stress, right? And we're going to see why in the book. But he seems at a person who is not only at war with society in a way, like with the bourgeoisie, and this sort of typical kind of almost cliche idea of like the artist who is, wants to see himself as apart from society. But he is a guy who is at war with himself. He doesn't know where he fits in. He doesn't know what his own values are. And he contemplates death and suicide a number of times in the book. And that's part of what the book is about. Page 8 of the preface says, I'd already given, remember the book again, the book is a a book within a book because we're reading the preface to Steppenwolf's own account of his own life, and that's essentially what the book Steppenwolf is, even though it's a book within a book. On page 8, it says, I've already given some account of the Steppenwolf's outward appearance. He gave at the very first glance the impression of a significant and uncommon and unusually gifted man. His face was intellectual, and the abnormally delicate and mobile play of his features reflected a soul of extremely emotional and unusually delicate sensibility. When one spoke to him and he, as was not always the case, dropped conventionalities and said personal and individual things that came out of his own alien world, not alien in terms of fake and gray alien in terms of he doesn't belong. He had thought more than other men. And in matters of the intellect, he had that calm objectivity, that certainty of thought and knowledge such as only really intellectual men have, who have no axe to grind, who never wish to shine or to talk others down or to appear always in the right. Now, I can say without saying, like, one of the reasons we read literature is because we see ourselves in characters, right? Shouts out to Nateski out there. Good to see you, homeboy Nate Dog. And shouts out to Jerry. Love you guys. Thank you for being here, y'all. Appreciate you. We see ourselves in these characters, and we not only see who we are kind of as a mirror in literature by accident a lot of times, right? We just discover these things the more we read. But we also learn more about who we are. We learn things about ourselves, and I think it's interesting to look back on this book, with perspective and hindsight, and to see some of the ways that I personally relate to this character in a number of ways. And one is that, and I think probably everyone watching this can relate to this in some way, and that is, without making a commentary on the way people are or something like that, because I find that to be low-hanging fruit. Not for other people to say such things, but we already know this. But what I think is that I had a conversation with somebody this week that was enlightening in a way. And it was basically that this dude was saying how, we were talking, and basically all of the ways that people would describe a person they never fit. They never live up to the personal conversations that you can have with somebody, where you see that they have a lot to say and they have a particular insight. Whether you agree or disagree with their insights or their ideas, they clearly are a person who thinks. And we all either feel this way about ourselves, or we know somebody like this, probably, hopefully. But I think that one interesting thing, the way that this guy put this to me, was he said basically that most people seem to be now, they seem to have this mode where you talk to them, like I'm talking in real life. You talk to a person in real life, like you're out in the world, and they kind of look at you blankly, and they don't have. It's like they read what you're saying sort of registers that you're a human being and that you're having a conversation with them, and they can almost, it's like Bateman says, they can almost pretend like they understand or that they have human emotions, and they do, but when they walk away, they have no comprehension of what you've said, because most people don't really think or consider things on a deeper level. And I don't know if that's most people. I don't know. But the way this guy put it was pretty astute. And it made sense in the light of a different conversation. But, and without being too specific, what that basically means is, like, if you were to go out in the world outside right now, and you see an old friend or you see someone like that, and you have a conversation and you talk about something meaningful, in even like you plunge just below the surface of like a surface, conversation. You get into meaning or subtext or something that's important, whether it's about the world or about yourself or personal details or whatever. But it's most likely that person's going to walk away and just kind of have a vague impression of what you were saying, but they won't be able to summarize it at all. And they certainly won't be able to decipher and to discuss the merits of what you were saying. And that's pretty, when that happens a lot and you start to notice it, I think that can create in a person a real sense of disillusionment, right? With everyday interactions or with society, not to become like some sort of, doomer, like or a schizo or something, but just in a way where it can be disconcerting, if that makes sense. And that really, it's interesting that I had that conversation with this guy, because that really gets at what the Steppenwolf's problem is, or what his issue is, because he doesn't feel like he relates to other people, and not just relates to other people, but that he lives almost on another planet. Right? He's not a dude like sitting at home, like, with his corkboard and his, and all that. I'm saying that, like, he's an artist, he's a writer, and he's just a deep thinker. He's hypersensitive and he's a deep thinker, but no one really, he doesn't find any place in the world. And that his problem mainly is the bourgeois attitudes, and the kind of creature comforts that belie a sense of any sort of deeper meaning, if that makes sense. This says, it was a look that did not simply criticize the lecture, annihilating the famous man with its delicate but crushing irony. That was the least of it. It was more sad than ironical. The despair of his not only unmasked the conceited lecture when he's at college, and dismissed with its irony the matter at hand, the expectant gratitude of the public and the attitude of the public, the somewhat presumptuous title under which the lecture was announced. No, the Steppenwolf's look pierced our whole epoch, its whole overwrought activity, the whole surge and strife, the whole vanity, the whole superficial play of a shallow, opinionated intellectuality. And that actually will tie in pretty nicely with Ezra Pound and one of his poems, and that is, I'm just going to read this real quick. This is from Canto 81 in Ezra Pound's selected cantos, because I couldn't help but think of this. And this has a slightly ecclesiastical language to it. But at the end of the canto, he says, master thyself, then others shall thee bear. Pull down thy vanity. Thou art a beaten dog beneath the hail, a swollen magpie in a fitful sun, half black, half white. Not knowest thou wing from tail? Pull down thy vanity. How mean thy hates fostered in falsity. Pull down thy vanity. Rave to destroy. Pull down thy vanity. I say pull down. But to have done instead of not doing, this is not vanity. To have with decency knocked that a blunt should open, to have gathered from the air a live tradition, or from a fine old eye the unconquered flame, this is not vanity. Here error is all in the not done, all in the diffidence that faltered. So what he's saying here is that this is the modernist era. And of course this gets synthesized into postmodernity, and into where we are now. He says, let's see. I saw that Haller was a genius of suffering, and that in the meaning of many sayings of Nietzsche, he had created within himself, with positive genius, a boundless and frightful capacity for pain. I saw at the same time that the root of his pessimism was not world contempt, but self-contempt. For however mercilessly he might annihilate institutions and persons in his talk, he never spared himself. It was always at himself first and foremost that he aimed the shaft, himself first and foremost, whom he hated and despised. Now, part of the book is the exploration of the destruction of the ego. And we see this, Jay was talking about this recently in terms of cults, right? One of the main aims of the cult, especially on the first initiation, always seems to be the destruction of the ego, the annihilation of the I. Right, and that is where Steppenwolf goes on his journey. You can see him going there, but as it says on page 11, It says, he directed during his whole life the whole wealth of his fancy, the whole of his thought, and insofar as he let loose upon himself every barbed criticism, every anger and hate he could command, he was, in spite of all, a real Christian and a real martyr. As for others and the world around him, he never ceased in his heroic and earnest endeavor to love them, to be just to them, to do them no harm, for the love of his neighbor was as deeply in him as the hatred of himself. And so his whole life was an example that love of one's neighbor is not possible without love of oneself. It says, let's see. He's got a. He's surrounded by books in his house. The books constantly increase, for besides bringing whole armfuls back with him from the libraries, he was always getting parcels of them by the post. He lives in his books. And he also has, it says on page 13, besides his limping gait that often made the stairs fatiguing to him, he seemed to be plagued by other troubles, and he at once said to me that it was years since he had either good digestion or sound sleep. So the limping gait is an obvious Byronic reference. This guy is supposed to be a Byronic hero. Because he is. He's sort of a post-Byronic hero in the modernist era, not at home in his own time. Kind of like when we did our Dylan Thomas analysis, we described Dylan Thomas as a romantic poet, essentially born too late. He's born in the wrong era. A lot of times culture will describe people this way in a kind of a flippant manner. Oh, that person was born too late, right? While the geniuses seem to be born too early many times. They are sort of aliens in their own world because they say and do things that people can't comprehend in time, only to turn out to be true later. This says on page 17, during that very first conversation about the Oricaria, he called himself the Steppenwolf, and this too estranged and disturbed me a little. What an expression! However, custom did not reconcile me to it, but soon I never thought of him by any other name, nor could I today hit on a better description of him. A wolf of the steppe that had lost its way and strayed into the town, and the life of the herd. A more striking image could not be found for his shy loneliness, his savagery, his restlessness, his homesickness, his homelessness. This is, again, an archetype we see over and over, especially in modern literature and in the modern novel. We see this with Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. We kind of see a lot of the events in this book in the book The Magus. Of course, we see it in Poe, which is American Romanticism. But we see this over and over, Camus. But he goes in a different direction than existentialism or Camus. He's a lonely stranger with downcast eyes. He was completely absorbed in himself and for about 10 minutes so happily lost and wrapped in pleasant dreams that I paid more attention to him than to the music. His heroes are all dead. His heroes are all Goethe, Mozart. No more is needed to show that the Steppenwolf lived a suicidal existence. But all the same, I do not believe that he took his own life when, after paying all he owed, but without a word of warning or farewell, he left our town one day and vanished. Page 20, no, I'm sure he has not taken his own life. And then here we get the reference to that Zbigniew Brzezinski took. And I'm just going to read this whole little passage here because he used this, again, as the epigraph for Between Two Ages. It says, these records, however much or however little of real life may lie at the back of them, are not an attempt to disguise or to palliate this widespread sickness of our times. They are an attempt to present the sickness itself in its actual manifestation. In other words, it's not a moral tale. It's not a fable. It is simply it's like I'm presenting the painting of what happened, and here it is. He's going to show us this guy's life, and we are to read into it what we will. They mean literally a journey through hell, a sometimes fearful, sometimes courageous journey through the chaos of a world whose souls dwell in darkness, a journey undertaken with the determination to go through hell from one end to the other, to give battle to chaos, and to suffer torture to the full. So it's essentially a Neo season in hell. It's an 1871 season in hell, a Rambodian season in hell, 1871, 1874. Rimbaud stopped writing when he was 19, born in 1854, died in 1891. A remark of Haller's gave me the key to this interpretation. He said to me once when we were talking of this is really interesting, when we were talking of the so-called horror of the Middle Ages, you guys are going to relate to this. These horrors were really non-existent. A man of the Middle Ages would detest the whole mode of our present-day life as something far more than horrible, far more than barbarous. Every age, every culture, every custom and tradition has its own character, its own weakness and its own strength, its beauties and ugliness. Accepts certain sufferings as matters of course, puts up patiently with certain evils. Human life is reduced to real suffering, to hell, only when two ages, two cultures, and religions overlap. A man of the classical age who had to live in medieval times would suffocate miserably just as a savage does in the midst of our civilization. Now there are times when a whole generation is caught in this way between two ages. Two modes of life, with the consequence that it loses all power to understand itself and has no standard, no security, no simple acquiescence. Naturally, everyone does not feel that equally strongly. A nature such as Nietzsche's had to suffer our present life, our present ills more than a generation in advance. What he had to go through alone and misunderstood, thousands suffer today. So we get the Z-Big reference, right? I often had to think of these words while reading the records. Haller, the Steppenwolf, Harry Haller, belongs to those who have been caught between two ages, who are outside of all security and simple acquiescence. He belongs to those whose fate it is to live the whole riddle of human destiny heightened to the pitch of a personal torture, a personal hell. Therein, it seems to me, lies the meaning these records can have for us, and sometimes of this. And because of this, I decided to publish them. For the rest, I neither approve nor condemn them. Let every reader do as his conscience bids him. And now we have Harry Haller's record, which is the record of the Steppenwolf itself. So this is written in the first person, and this is going to be the actual Steppenwolf's record. Okay, so if you guys want to support me before I go on, please make sure you smash that like. Really appreciate y'all out there for being with me here. Smash that like. Cheers, y'all. GMO drinks all around. You can sponsor a stream, as always, by clicking PayPal, Cash App, Venmo. Drop me $100 and get me to do a sponsored stream. We got some sponsored streams coming up. Of course, as I said at the very beginning, the next stream we're going to do is courtesy of our boy Ryan, which is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. Then we're going to do a courtesy of our homegirl out there, Talita. Our based Kiwi, Talita, who has sponsored a stream on Tennessee Williams. We're going to do Streetcar Named Desire and The Glass Menagerie. We've also got one on, let's see, our homeboy John. I think it was John, our homeboy John out there, who sponsored one on a couple of films and also the films of Wes Anderson. So we got those coming up. And also, we got big things in the works. I can't really mention it right now, but we got big things on the works, on the way. And you're going to see me in some other places discussing all sorts of things: Poe, literature, art, film, painting. So I will post those in the community tab when they come up. And shouts out to all of our homeboys out there, and I hope everybody is well. Let's see, this says, for Mad Men Only. The text is called For Mad Men Only. And this is, again, the Steppenwolf. The day had gone by, just as days go by. I had killed it in accordance with my primitive and retiring way of life. I had worked for an hour or two and perused the pages of old books. Perused, by the way, as Norm Macdonald points out, again, means to read deeply, not to scan and browse. I had had pains for 2 hours, as elderly people do. I had taken a powder and been very glad when the pains consented to disappear. This powder is going to turn out to be, when he meets this guy, Pablo. Interesting he's called Pablo in this. Is going to be, he experiments with laudanum, opium. I don't know if it's an experimentation because he takes laudanum. He takes opiates. But then he's later going to come across this guy, Pablo, a saxophone player, who functions basically as you remember Nick in Eyes Wide Shut, the organ player who's essentially, I think, working with the group, the pyramid group, as an agent of the psyop that he puts Tom Coombs through. Right. Well, this guy, Fidelio, the password's Fidelio. This is basically what Pablo is in the book. But Pablo is also a dealer and gives him some cocaine. Of course, he takes cocaine for his toothache, too. This is 1927. But that's what he's going to do in the book. And it says, so was the reading of old books, so was the lying in the warm bath. But taken all in all, it had not been exactly a day of rapture, nor had it even been a day of brightened with happiness and joy. Rather, it had just been one of those days which for a long while now had fallen to my lot. The moderately pleasant, the whole bearable and tolerable, lukewarm day of a discontented middle-aged man. Days without special pains, without special cares, without particular worry, without despair. Days when I calmly wonder, objective and fearless, whether it isn't time to follow the example of this guy Stifter and have an accident while shaving because he's continually contemplating suicide. He talks about the vampires of finance, the world of men, and the so-called culture grins back at us with the lying, vulgar, brazen glamour of a fair and dogs us with the persistence of an emetic. And when all is concentrated and focused to the last pitch of the intolerable upon your sick self, he who has known these days of hell may be content indeed with normal half and half days like today. This is interesting because this is a day that. Well, they used it for shouts out to Slowboy Whiteboard out there. Shouts out to Kristen. They used it as a topical anesthetic. Can you believe that? Yeah, it was an anesthetic for a toothache. It numbs the tooth. They also used it for eye surgery, but this is interesting because this is, even though the style of the writing here is in a kind of a syntax of a, late or post-Victorian prose and an early modern sort of descriptive but showing prose, the sentiment involved is wholly now. It's present, right? I mean, this is kind of, you could read this book. This is kind of why I related to the book when I read it, because I read it in 2000 and I'd been a teenager in the 90s. And this is a book that it's the same thing as, Eric Bogosian's Suburbia or SFW or any kind of 90s, what they called back then, kids, they called it the slacker generation, right? So it's this dude who's just sitting around kind of not doing anything, but wondering why he didn't do anything, but also not having anything to do, and then just kind of railing in his own head about society. That's a very Gen X way of looking at things, back then at least. It continues to recur. It's still present now. But, this is why the book appeals to you when you're younger, right? And what else was I going to say about that? Let's see, this says, I found Blakean allusions in here, like in Blake's Proverbs from Hell, right? He says, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, says William Blake, which is a very sort of Gnostic, almost Neoplatonic way of looking at suffering. It's also Rambodian, right? I believe in a long, prolonged derangement of the senses to attain the unknown. Although we live in the subconscious, our pale reason hides the infinite from us, says Rimbaud. And this is essentially what the Steppenwolf, that's his sort of M.O. On page 27, in desperation, I have to escape and throw myself on the road to pleasure, or if that cannot be, on the road to pain. There you go. A wild longing for strong emotions and sensations seethes in me, a rage against this toneless, flat, normal, and sterile life. So he wants to be overloaded with sensation, which, again, is a very teenage sort of Rimbaud. I mean, Rimbaud was a teenager when he wrote A Season in Hell, but he says, give me anything as long as it's strong. For what I've always hated and detested and cursed above all things was this contentment, this healthiness and comfort, this carefully preserved optimism of the middle classes, this fat and prosperous brood of mediocrity. So I went down the stairs from my room in the attic, these difficult stairs of this alien world, those thoroughly bourgeois, well-swept and scoured stairs of a respectable three-family apartment house under whose roof I have my refuge. And he goes out into the world. So what's interesting here is that, again, the plot, if you look up a plot summary of Steppenwolf, there's not much plot because not much happens in terms of any sort of accomplishments or tasks relating to the outside world or duty. The duty is all it's all a journey of exploration and self-discovery and trying to find what his duty is. He says on page 29, how I used to love the dark, sad evenings of late autumn and winter, how eagerly I imbibed their moods of loneliness and melancholy when wrapped in my cloak I strode for half the night through rain and storm, through the leafless winter landscape, lonely enough then too, but full of deep joy and full of poetry, which later I wrote down by candlelight sitting on the edge of my bed. All that was past now. The cup was emptied and would never be filled again. I mean, is there a better description of the dark artist poet? This is why I loved the book when I was 20, because that like I really, I think a lot of dudes can relate to this in a number of ways, but like that's the description of the artist, right? Going out at night, having your thoughts at night, going out in the rain, in the dark, rainy streets of Belfast, coming back and writing poems about megalomania. So it's also interesting just to take stock of myself reading this again, how I'm closer in age. I personally am closer in age now to Harry Haller now than I was when I initially read the book. When I initially read the book, I was the speaker at the beginning of the book who's relating Harry Haller to the Steppenwolf story. Now I'm closer in age to Harry Haller. Also, it reminds me of a Norm Macdonald joke about lone wolves. Have you guys heard this one? He says, he got Billy Bob Thornton to read it. The worst part about being a lone wolf is finding someone to do the wolf wheelbarrow races with you at the lone wolf picnic. Get it? It's meta. Okay. All right. So some will get that. He says, okay, here we get Gnostic and Neoplatonic mystical visions on page 30. He says, let's see. I sped through heaven and saw God at work. I suffered holy pains. I dropped all my defenses and was afraid of nothing in the world. I accepted all things, and to all things I gave up my heart. Sometimes for a minute or two I saw it clearly, threading my life like a divine and golden track. Once it came to me while reading a poet, while pondering a thought of Descartes, of Pascal. Again, it shone out and drove its gold track far into the sky while I was in the presence of my beloved. Ah, but it is hard to find this track of the divine in the midst of this life we lead, in this besotted humdrum age of spiritual blindness, with its architecture, its business, its politics, its men. Now, that's not necessarily Gnostic, but that's pretty, in fact, that's pretty relatable, right? That's pretty relatable in a number of ways. But when he talks about his beloved, yes, I took him from Jacques Attali on the set of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Shouts out to Jeff. And yeah, it's relatable, but this is also kind of a Dantean reference to his beloved, to Beatrice, right? And to the golden track. Now the golden track turns into a kind of a hellish track, a circular hellish track into the inferno here. He says, on the other hand, what happens to me in my rare hours of joy, what for me is bliss and life and ecstasy and exultation, the world in general, in life, it finds it absurd. In fact, if the world is right, if this music of the cafes, these mass enjoyments, and these Americanized men who are pleased with so little are right, then I'm wrong, I'm crazy. It's interesting how the speaker in this book makes a few dotted references throughout to Americanization, which is kind of at one point, let's see, this is on page, he makes a reference to Americanization versus, it's essentially capitalism versus communism later on in the book. And he sees those as part of the dialectic. So on page 188 and 189, I'm going to come back to the beginning, but he mentions depopulation. He says, Gustav smiled, page 188. Yes, there are indeed too many men in the world. This is when he's in the Magic Theater in one of his hellish visions. he takes the door to the other side, which is kind of a door into the labyrinth of his psyche. And and this is one of the pathways that he's on. And he says, in earlier days, it wasn't so noticeable, but now everyone wants air to breathe, a car to drive as well. One does notice it. Of course, what we are doing isn't rational. It's childishness, but just as war is childishness on a gigantic scale. In times, mankind will learn to keep its numbers in check by rational means. Meanwhile, we are meeting an intolerable situation in a rather irrational way. However, the principle is correct. We eliminate. Yes, said I. What we are doing is probably mad, and probably it is good and necessary all the same. It is not a good thing when man overstrains his reason and tries to reduce its rational order matters that are not susceptible of rational treatment. Then there arise ideals such as those of the Americans or of the Bolsheviks, and we become a machine-made article. It is for madmen like us, perhaps, to ennoble it again. So he's talking about Depop there, and really predicting Depop on a globalist model, which is pretty interesting in a 1927 novel, work of art. He enters, when he gets up and going back to the beginning, when he gets up and he walks outside of his house, he's wandering the streets looking for experience. As Kristen said, are you experienced? He walks the streets and he comes across the magic theater, this sort of theater of dreams. And this is both literal and figurative in the book. You imagine that he literally finds this place where he meets these people and he, takes these drugs and does all this stuff. But he is also, it's also a figurative journey into the subtext of his mind. It says for madmen only. So of course he takes the door and he goes inside. And inside, he walks past, he says, on page 35, there's a reference to Hamlet and Ophelia. Then he says, the old books of the monks softly illumined with their miniatures, and the books of the German poets of 200 and 100 years ago, whom their own folk have forgotten, all the thumbed and damp-stained volumes and the works in print and manuscripts of the old composers, the stout and yellowing music sheets, dreaming their music through a winter sleep, who heard their spirited, their roguish and yearning tones, who carried through a world estranged from them a heart full of their spirit and their charm. And here we go on page 36. And who hoped in secret at the last turn of the labyrinth of chaos for revelation and God's presence. So now he's taking a kind of a neo-Gnostic journey of the mind into the labyrinth of his psyche, searching for the revelation of God. And again, I get references to and allusions to, whether unconscious or conscious, this is kind of the landscape of T.S. Eliot's landscape of literature, and we get the reference to the broken landscape of the world, especially post-World War I, broken in terms of broken up with, what have they done to the earth? Tied her with fencers and dragged her down, says Jim Morrison, but also broken up with the breastworks and the trenches. Also broken and fragmentary in terms of the shell shock generation. And he's going into the BPD labyrinth of his own mind. He says on page 37, solitude is independence. He then comes to, he says on page 38, the music in the place was at least sincere, unashamedly primitive, and childishly happy. There was something of the American in it, who with all its strength seems so boyishly fresh and childlike to us Europeans. Was Europe to become the same? He questions. Interesting question that he poses. Yes. Globalization takes hold on the prison planet. And he says, the mysterious tablet above it, above the sign of the door, and the illuminated letters dancing in mockery. How did the writing run? Entrance not for everybody, for madmen only. And then he comes to a further sign, anarchist evening entertainment magic theater, entrance not for everybody. So he goes in. And then when he goes in, we discover the treatise of the Steppenwolf, and we discover that he begins to really take stock of who he is. And that he has two natures. Remember in Apocalypse Now? Remember the Apocalypse Now stream? It says, in the Apocalypse Now Redux, remember, it's one of my favorite parts in the Redux. She says, you'll see there are two of you. One that loves and one that kills. Right. And here he discovers that the Steppenwolf himself has two natures, a human and a wolfish one, of course, because he's a Steppenwolf. They were in continual and deadly enmity. Wolfishly seen, all human activities became horribly absurd and misplaced, stupid, and vain. So the dichotomy here and this sort of Gnostic duality, like on page 44 and 45, is that there is a light and a dark, a hard and a soft, right? There's a black and a white. There is a civilized bourgeois nature to him, and there's also a savage, primitive, primordial nature to him. There's a human and a wolf. So he becomes a kind of a werewolf. It says, many artists are of this kind. These persons all have two souls, two beings within them. There is God and the devil in them, the mother's blood and the father's, the capacity for happiness and the capacity for suffering. And in just such a state of enmity and entanglement towards and within each other as were the wolf and man in Harry. And these men, for whom life has no repose, live at times in their rare moments of happiness with such strength and indescribable beauty. Thus, like a precious, fleeting foam over a sea of suffering, arise all works of art, in which a single individual lifts himself for an hour so high above his personal destiny that his happiness shines like a star and appears to all who see it as something eternal and as a happiness of their own. Their life consists of a perpetual tide, unhappy and torn with pain, terrible and meaningless, unless one is ready to see its meaning in just those rare experiences, acts, thoughts, and works that shine out above the chaos of such a life. To such men, the desperate and horrible thought has come that perhaps the whole of human life is but a bad joke, a violent and ill-fated aberration of the primal mother, a savage and dismal catastrophe of nature. Isn't that Gnosticism? Right? That the prison planet that you live on is not your own, right? That it's been corrupted, and that that the world we live in is fashioned by the demiurge, and you're going to have to unite with the Sophia principle to get back to the true world of forms. I mean, it's interesting that what happens next, without too much, direct quoting from the book, because you can the language of the book is so almost Whitman-esque. It obviously takes a lot of its cue from the verse, from the long, fluid verse of Walt Whitman, and is sort of transposed into a modernist prose. Rimbaud also took a lot of that from Whitman. I mean, Whitman is essentially the beginning of modern poetry. But later on in the book, what Harry Haller will do is he will meet this woman that he falls in. Well, he thinks he falls in love with her. Her name is Hermine, and he confuses her, or he sees her in his mind labyrinth as his childhood friend Herman. Hold, please. As his friend Herman. And so he's going back to his youth. But do you see the hermaphroditic principle? It's like because he goes to this Eyes Wide Shut party, and he essentially sees an as above, so below Baphomet as the centerpiece of this Eyes Wide Shut party, and then decides to pursue that as this like unity principle for going into the path to illumination. So it's Gnostic, right? But Hermine is obviously also supposed to be some sort of occult hermetic principle, and Sophia, she's clearly supposed to be the allegory of the personified Sophia. And then later on, when he meets, basically she tells him when they get together, there's some very human conversations, like they're talking and she tells him her name, or he tells her his name, but then he doesn't ask her name, and she's like, we've been talking for 30 minutes and you still haven't yes. The answer to that's yes. You haven't told me, you haven't asked me my name. And he's like, wait, what's your name? And she's like, it's too late. And that's an interesting take on how this dude kind of represents, the youthful sort of verging on schizo dude who doesn't know how to talk to girls. Okay. And And he clearly doesn't know how to talk to her. And even though he's old in the book, he's 40, he's like 47, 48. But she basically tells him how to talk to her. Then she tells him her name, and then he goes further into his journey. And then she teaches him how to dance. The dancing is interesting because at times some of the characters clearly have the language of Judge Holden in Blood Meridian. I'm sure Cormac McCarthy's read this book, and I don't know if he consciously took from this book, but the way that the characters pirouette with nimble feet, in large sort of globular bodies, is in this hellish masquerade cavalcade of weird archetypal figures, is clearly not just from this book. It's Decameron, and it is Commedia dell'arte, and it's a sort of a puppet show, but live. But put that in the context of like Mask of the Red Death and the Decameron and the Plague and, Journals of the Plague Year, and how the plague in this is obviously supposed to be the plague of modernity and bourgeois values, right? But what she's like, you're not in love with me, but when you fall in love with me, I only ask one thing, but you have to agree to it no matter what it is. And he says, yes, of course. And she says, when you fall in love with me, you have to kill me, which is interesting because he has to fall in love with Sophia, Hermine, this Hermetic principle, the Sophia principle, and then kill her, which is like another side of his ego. And what that's supposed to represent is that he, in a way, the way that Hesse writes it, is that he's supposed to be killing the death instinct or the suicidal instinct within himself. So he's killing for love. So do you get the opposites? It's like a unification of opposites. That, I know this is a lot, okay, and I know I'm probably not making much sense. But he's supposed to kill the thing that he loves most, which is outside of himself, but in the vision of the theater, the dream theater, or the mad theater, or the magic theater, or the theater of the absurd, or the theater of cruelty, Artaud's theater of cruelty. It's supposed to be that he's killing off the thing that he loves most, which is actually the death instinct. He actually, because all he does in a lot of this book, he continuously talks about, well, I can just go home and end it all. And he wants to give up. So in the end, he's supposed to learn that he's supposed to appreciate life instead of death. That's like, there's not a message in the book. It's not a fable, but he is supposed to appreciate life. He's supposed to keep on living. On page 63, it says, this Steppenwolf of ours has always been aware of at least the Faustian twofold nature within him. Faustian is interesting because he continuously references Goethe, and he actually even meets a sort of a specter of Goethe in the book, as well as Mozart, his sort of dual heroes. It's interesting that it's Goethe and Mozart. Of course, he's German, so of course it's Goethe, but... And, of course, we've covered Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe's, Kit Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. But he's supposed to meet Goethe. And this is interesting because this is something that I learned in drama school. One of my instructors there, one of my acting, teachers there, told us about when performing Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, the D-pop pervert, George Bernard Shaw. But he said that Shaw said that art is essentially supposed to be, it's like imagine a Guinness and champagne, okay, and the Guinness is like the heaviness of Wagner, and the champagne is the lightness and airiness and the bubbles of Mozart, if that makes any sense. This Steppenwolf of ours has always been aware of at least the Faustian twofold nature within him. He has discovered that the one fold of the body is not inhabited by one fold of the soul, and that at best he is only at the beginning of a long pilgrimage towards his ideal harmony. It's, again, that's interesting how many times we've come across this pilgrimage in terms of literature. I mean, we just covered that with The Road, right? The pilgrimage which has its allusions to Virgil and Dante in the Inferno. He would like either to overcome the wolf and become holy man, or to renounce mankind and at last to live wholly a wolf's life. It may be presumed that he has never carefully watched a real wolf. Had he done so, he would have seen perhaps that even animals are not undivided in spirit. With them, too, the well-knit beauty of the body hides a being of manifold states and strivings. The wolf, too, has its abysses. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to cross the Al Crowley abyss and try to confront himself. Harry can never turn back again and become wholly wolf, and could he do so, he would find then even the wolf is not of primeval simplicity, but already a creature of manifold complexity. There is, in fact, no way back either to the wolf or to the child. From the very start, there is no innocence and no singleness. Every created thing, even the simplest, is already guilty, already multiple, he says. It has been thrown into the muddy stream of being and may never more swim back again to its source. The way to innocence, to the uncreated, and to God leads on, not back to the wolf or to the child, but even further into sin, even deeper into human life, he says. Then he goes into a Neoplatonic treatise. All birth means separation from the all, of course. He's going to say that. Right. Because we're reading a proto-postmodernist, but, height of modernity, but proto-postmodernist work with a neo-Gnostic and Platonic bent. A man who can understand Buddha, he says on page 65, and has an intuition of the heaven and hell of humanity ought not to live in a world ruled by common sense and democracy and bourgeois standards. Again, that's Rimbaud. That's from Illuminations. He again the prison planet, and he cannot see that this whole world, this Eden, and this manifestation of beauty and terror, of greatness and meanness, of strength and tenderness, is crushed and imprisoned by the wolf legend, just as the real man in him is crushed and imprisoned by that sham existence, the bourgeois. He shares a bit of doggerel verse here. On page 70, he takes laudanum. I had in my medicine chest an excellent means of stilling pain, an unusually strong tincture of laudanum. On page 71, I put my resolution in this way. The next time I felt that I must have a recourse to opium. And he says he's going to wait till his 50th birthday to off himself. Let's see. Pages 94 and 95, summary of his artistic and Gnostic conflict. He says, like all great spirits, Herr von Goethe, he meets Goethe, or at least a specter of Goethe, his hero, in the Magic Theater. You have clearly recognized and felt the riddle and the hopelessness of human life with its moments of transcendence that sink again to wretchedness and the impossibility of rising to one fair peak of feeling except at the cost of many days' enslavement to the daily round. And then the ardent longing for the realm of the spirit, an eternal and deadly war with the equally ardent holy love of the lost innocence of nature. The whole frightful suspense in vacancy and uncertainty, this condemnation to the transient that can never be valid, that is ever experimental and dilettantish. In short, the utter lack of purpose to which the human state is condemned to its consuming despair. He mentions the well-tempered clavier, which is Beethoven, but is also the title of one of the episodes of Westworld. Do you remember that? And then later on page 126 here, he meets when he's talking to Hermine says, "Do you know that we are both children of the devil?" She says, "Yes, that is what we are. The devil is the spirit, and we are his unhappy children. We have fallen out of nature and hang suspended in space." And that reminds me of something. In the Steppenwolf treatise that I told you about, there is something to the effect that it is only a fancy of his to believe that he has one soul, or two, that he is made up of one or two personalities. Every human being, it says, consists of 10 or 100 or 1,000 souls. So she's telling him that they're children of the devil, and then telling him that, he is Legion. Right. Crispy says, why wasn't BLA streaming back in 84, 85 when I was reading this shit? Shouts out to Crispy out there. Because when I was 5, I was reading... when I was 5, tying into this book, I was obsessed with Mozart. Because I saw the movie Amadeus when I was 4 years old on HBO at a hotel when we went on vacation to Williamsburg, Virginia. And I remember the TV was in a separate room. I turned it on. I turned the dial, and Amadeus was on. Because it was a scene where he was with, what's her name? His hot wife in the movie. And they're like making jokes under the table. And then from then on, I was like obsessed with Mozart. And I started playing the piano after that. And I would write, there was a bust of Mozart also in the library at school. And then I would check out books on Mozart. And then I would write. It said that Mozart had written, his symphony when he was 5. No, he wrote his symphony later, but he was writing minuets when he was 5. And he was a prodigy. And I learned to play piano I didn't learn to read music. I learned by ear, right? And I would write fake. I got sheet music from school, and then I would write fake symphonies on it. And then later, I went to Mozart's house in Salzburg when I was in Austria. I still love Mozart, but anyway, Steppenwolf also loves Mozart. We get the Hermetic principle on page 128. And that he's a student of Mozart and Goethe on page 129. There you go. Then he meets this guy, Pablo, the musician. And this is interesting because he meets Pablo, and Pablo is a kind of a old Nick jester, trickster, Lucifer figure who plays the saxophone in the little orchestra at the Magic Theater. But the conversation that he has with Pablo is interesting because he asks Pablo to talk about art and literature and music, and Pablo then basically doesn't answer him, but then finally says to him, look, it does me no good to deconstruct music because I am a musician. So I just make the art. You can deconstruct it. And that's interesting because that's a sentiment that you get I discussed this in the T.S. Eliot stream, how people would often, they would when critics would talk to T.S. Eliot and would ask him to deconstruct the meaning of The Wasteland, they would say, what do the first 4 lines of The Wasteland mean? And T.S. Eliot would just say, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, stirring dull roots with spring rain, mixing memory and desire. In other words, he would just read the poem. And eventually the critics caught on, he's not going to deconstruct the poem for us because the poem means exactly what it says. It says what it means what it says. We can deconstruct it. And he can do that in his private correspondence or in his letters or in his correspondence with Ezra Pound, but he's not going to do it with us now. And that's essentially what Pablo does. And then we find out that Pablo is a dealer, and it says the almost immediate effect was that he gave him a pinch from his little gold box, a pinch of powder. The almost immediate effect was that I became clearer in the head and more cheerful. No doubt, he says, there was cocaine in the powder. He offered them to his friends now and then and was a master in the mixing and prescribing of them. He had drugs for stilling pain, for inducing sleep, for begetting beautiful dreams, lively spirits, and the passion of love. So so now we are in clear Night Porter, Salon Kitty, The Damned, Mephisto era Weimar Germany, where they are. You guys remember the movie Interview with the Vampire? Great movie. Interview with the Vampire kind of dramatizes this, right? I remember John Malcatraz. You are part of modernity. Man, monkey, Nosferatu, vampire. Remember that? And Carrie Elwes and the lady. Who's the lady? The lady in it is the same one who was in Braveheart. She went to Oxford School of Drama. Anyway, she's a morphine addict. So they're all taking morphine and cocaine and going to these weird Eyes Wide Shut Weimar, parties where they have, let's say, Baphomet-esque characters, and that is what Harry Haller does in this. Yeah, that movie's nuts. Oh, interesting about that. Did you know that? What is it? Shadow of the Vampire. Did I say Interview with the Vampire? Yeah, that's Tom Coombe. I meant Shadow of the Vampire because it's got Willem Dafoe in it. Willem Dafoe's awesome in that movie. Did you know that that Nick Cage was produced the movie. He produced the movie, and he was supposed to star in the movie, but then he didn't. He had something to do with the writing of the movie, but anyway, he produced it. But finally, Nick Cage is doing his vampire movie. Shouts out to Jeff because he shared something with me the other day. Because there's a movie with I think Nicholas Hoult and Willem Dafoe coming out this year about Renfield. I got a part as Renfield in a Dracula play, but I turned it down. But anyway. So I think it's called Renfield. But anyway, Nick Cage is finally doing his vampire movie. On page 134 and 135, we actually get the mention of the logos. He says, we intellectuals, instead of fighting against this tendency, like men, and rendering obedience to the spirit, the logos, the word, and gaining a hearing for it, are all dreaming of a speech without words that utters the inexpressible and gives form to the formless. World of forms. On page 145, Pablo and the Sophia principal Hermetic Hermine offer to Steppenwolf to be in a menage. They want a menage a trois. And he turns it down. He says he gave us each a little opium to smoke, and sitting motionless with open eyes, all three lived through the senses that he suggested to us, while Maria trembled with delight. As I felt a little unwell after this, Pablo laid me on the bed and gave me some drops. While I lay with closed eyes, I felt the fleeting breath of a kiss on each eyelid. I took a kiss as though I believed it came from Maria, but I knew very well it came from him. He's horrified at this pervert, of course. And then eventually he talks to Hermine. She says about his ideas, you are right, Steppenwolf. You are right 1,000 times over, and yet you must go to the wall. He talks on page 154 and 155 about the kingdom of God. He calls it the kingdom of God, which is otherwise called eternity, the communion of saints. The saints are the true men, the younger brothers of the Savior. We are with them all our lives in every good deed, in every brave thought, and every love. He's striving, right? But he is also crossing this dark night of the soul, but this abyss, and then he goes into the mass ball. And when he enters the Magic Theater again, he goes into the mass ball, and he sees they're showing a film of the Ten Commandments. And then finally of the ball ceremony in the event, which is obviously why these devils around him are dressed like devils and are there for the ball ceremony, right? In the masked ball, get it? And then we get on page 186 and 187, the mention of Depop and the Gnostic Neo-Eden. 182 and 183 is I found a clear allusion to Ezra Pound's Canto 16. I read, 80? I read Canto 81 earlier, but Canto 16. Canto 14, because he mentions on this page something about, very pretty, we call it the Axel way. And I a good many axles of one sort or another are going to crash here, Harry, my boy, so watch out. And I found that to be a really small but precise reference to a note that Ezra Pound wrote in Canto 16, in his draft of Canto 16, where he talks about the clotted axle, which is basically like, what that means is modernity can be seen through the lens of the image of the mechanized warfare and the machine gun being hauled to the front and the trenches with a horse and cart, where the axles of the cart get clotted in the mud. So again, that goes back to the sort of between two ages of Zebig's epigraph and of the preface to this book. Or like in Canto 14, he talks about plunging jewels in the mud. And then in Canto 16, And before Canto 16, before Hellmouth, dry plain and two mountains, and on the one mountain a running form, and another in the turn of the hill, and hard steel. The road like a slow screw's thread, the angle almost imperceptible, so that the circuit seemed hardly to rise. And the running form, naked, Blake, reference to Blake there in Pound, shouting, whirling his arms, the swift limbs howling against the evil, his eyes rolling, whirling like flaming cartwheels, and his head held backward to gaze on the evil as he ran from it, to be hid by the steel mountain. And when he showed again from the north side, his eyes blazing toward Hellmouth. Modernity. Modernity, and Ezra Pound capturing that in verse form. Page 188, 189, we get capitalism versus communism. Let's see, where are we, guys? Again, shouts out to everybody here. Thank you for sticking with me. I know this is pretty... You might find this elementary, or you might find it cerebral. I don't know. Maybe you just find it fun or interesting just to take away the time. But thank you for being with me here. And what did Toledo say? Anyone read Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater? Yes, of course. Yes, he was eating opium, drinking laudanum, and that's one of the sort of key books in dealing with Coleridge and Georgian, and later, okay, let's call it 18th century and then 19th century Victorian, early Victorian, pre-Victorian, because 1837 for the Romantics, but Coleridge and De Quincey, and dealing with the literature, the kind of literature of opium that makes its way into the 20th century, and also influences people like that pervert who wrote Alice in Wonderland. But yeah, it's worth reading De Quincey, and worth reading Coleridge's own statements on opium, not just from his poems, not just from Kubla Khan. Coleridge was addicted to opium. He was also given that for a toothache, but he drank laudanum. And then, of course, the actual opium dens made their way into, after the Opium War, into England and the Anglo-American sphere. He talks about the absolute uncorrupted and incorruption of his youth, his idyllic halcyon days. Page 200 and 201. And then finally on 202, how one kills for love. He meets Mozart, witnesses Don Giovanni, then finally comes to White Light. He splits here. This is the BPD, D.I.D. aspect of the book in full, the kind of climactic culmination of this, where he comes upon Pablo and Hermine in coito, and he kills Hermine, but then finds that it was... We don't really know if this was a dream. It's not a dream. It's not like the book ends up a dream. Because it's real. It's literal. But is the killing just the figurative killing of this principle? Was she even really there? Page 210, he comes upon a little red upon a mask of death. So again, the mask of the Red Death. And then verses came into his head that had come upon him somewhere. So he writes poems that he's unaware of writing because he dissociates, and he says, "We above you, evermore residing in the ether star, translumined ice. No, nor day, nor night, nor times dividing, where nor age, nor sex is our device. Cool and unchanging is our eternal being. Cool and star bright is our eternal laughter." So in other words, he comes to the, let the brother receive the light, culmination of his illuminated Gnostic journey, and then realizes that he has, after he has killed this principle within himself, she says, he's told, "You're willing to die but not to live," on page 216. You are ready to stab girls to death. You are ready to be executed with all solemnity. You wanted to be executed and have your head chopped off. You are willing to die, you coward, but not to live. You are to live and to learn and to laugh. Exit the magic theater. And then I would traverse not once more, but often the hell of my inner being. One day I would be better hand at the game of death, the game of life and death. One day I would learn how to laugh. Pablo was waiting for me, and Mozart too. So he exits the magic theater, and that's the end of the book. That's it. That is Herman Hesse's Steppenwolf. Pretty wild book, right? Pretty crazy. So, again, I think that's an important book for understanding modernity, understanding now, understanding relevance, the relevance now, understanding at least reading the Gnostic journey through. I mean, it's got everything in the book, right? Depop, Z-Big references, post references, right? Back from Z-Big. Gnostic duality, bourgeois versus primal and primeval, youth, innocence versus experience, William Blake, youth versus old age, hindsight, foresight, multiple personalities, drug taking, solitude, capitalism versus communism. Sort of has everything. Talita says, imagine if David Lynch did a film on Steppenwolf. Yes, actually, that's pretty insightful because it is Lynchian in a number of ways. I mean, I can't imagine. There is a film of this with, I think, Max von Sydow, but I haven't seen it. It's from 1974. I haven't seen it. But honestly, I don't, this is kind of one of those, in a way, unfilmable books because so much of it is a hallucinatory journey of a hallucinatory journey into the mind. And it's hard to visualize that in terms of on two-dimensional film, right? But Crispy says, starring Peter Lorre. Oh, I didn't know. Is Peter Lorre in that film? So, so next, of course, like I said, we're going to get to, this will be, I don't know when this is going to be. It'll be this week, obviously. You're going to see me somewhere else. I'll put it on the community tab when it comes up, but I'll be doing another Poe analysis. And also, speaking of Poe, a movie came out yesterday. I watched a couple of movies in the last couple of days, you guys, that are pretty interesting. One is The Menu, which, of course, was covered expertly by JD, by our homeboy, our friend over there, Jay Dyer, at Jay's Analysis, who covered The Menu before Christmas. So I recommend everybody go back and watch that analysis of The Menu. It's worth watching. It's a pretty interesting movie. It has Ray Fiennes, of course, and the girl from all of the occult, Anya Taylor-Joy, right? It's got Nicholas Hoult in it. But, it's pretty interesting and revelatory in terms of some of his themes. I recommend that. Also, I watched The Pale Blue Eye yesterday. It came out yesterday on Netflix, on Flatnix. And it's Christian Bale. I can watch any movie with Christian Bale. I mean, I don't know about you, but there's how there are actors you can just sit anytime, in the old days when they would be on TV. Now you have to choose the movie. But back in the old days when they would just come on TV, anytime there was a Nicolas Cage movie or a Denzel Washington movie or there's a Christian Bale movie, I can watch it. And it's got Christian Bale and this weird dude who's going to end up getting an Oscar for something. But he's you'll know it when you see it. He plays Poe. I don't remember his name. He's a new actor. But The Pale Blue Eye, it's kind of a snoozer. I appreciated it because it's literary, because it's about Poe. It plays a minor character. And it's based on a book. I haven't read the book, The Pale Blue Eye. Maybe we'll cover it in the future. But it's pretty interesting because it's about Poe when he was at West Point. Poe was class of, he was born 1809. So he would have been class of, I think, 1830. Maybe he was class of 1830. No, he was class of 31, I think, because General R.E. Lee was class of 30. I think I'm right. He was a year older. Whatever the years were, he's a year older than Poe. He's not. Lee isn't in the movie, but it is interesting that they were both at West Point at the same time. Poe actually was expelled from West Point. He was born in Boston and grew up in Richmond, of course, with the Allens, who were successful and large landowners in planters and manufacturers in Richmond. And then later died in Baltimore. But that's why the Baltimore Ravens are the Baltimore Ravens, because of Poe's Raven. Even though the book, I would say Richmond takes way more ownership over Poe than those places do. But anyway, Poe did go to UVA, and also he was expelled from West Point for like gambling debts and a bunch of stuff. But anyway, it's a fictionalized Poe in the movie. And what happens is, I won't tell you what happens in the movie, but the end. But what happens is basically there's a murder at West Point. They find a cadet hanged, and he has been mutilated. He's had his heart cut out. And this is right up Poe's alley, of course. So Poe assists with the investigation by this policeman, who's played by Christian Bale, with kind of Christian Bale can obviously do a fantastic American accent, right? We've covered American Psycho, but he does more of a Bristolian accent in the film, and he had dissolved the Shirt Tails gangs and the kind of gangs in New York, 5 Points gangs. Even though that really that's concurrent with the War of Northern Aggression later because remember, Gangs of New York takes place around 1861. But he had dissolved some of the gangs in New York. Anyway, his character in the movie. But Poe assists him with the murder investigation because there are occult ties in the movie. And so the reason it's interesting to watch is because even though it's a kind of a snoozer and it's dark and snowy and all that stuff, it does get to some revelatory things, and of course it gets you there. Look, the movies are either going to be cannibalism, The Most Dangerous Game, or the occult, right? Shouts out to Ratsky out there. Ratsky says, who drops $10, drops $10 super chat. Ratsky says, McCarthy doesn't use apostrophes in words with not, like wouldn't or couldn't, but does use them in words like there. Is this a trend or unique to McCarthy? Good question. Good question. Good specific question dealing with form. This is not unique. In fact, McCarthy takes that almost, I don't know if he takes it from Faulkner purposefully, but Faulkner did the same thing. The reason that Faulkner did this, and there's a lot of Faulkner in McCarthy. They're both sort of similar locus and have similar themes. But one of the practical reasons that William Faulkner didn't do this was because he would storyboard his novels. Like, you can go to Roanoke and you can see the plot lines on the walls in his library and in his bedroom there, and in his office. Not his bedroom, his office and his library. And he would then sometimes have his niece or his daughter type up the manuscripts, and he would just say, just forget the apostrophes, just type it, just do it. And so he found them to be a hindrance. And you also see this in James Joyce. This is obviously a truly modern technique in writing. You see this in Joyce, and then later you see this in truly visual and imagistic poems like in E.E. Cummings, who does away with punctuation pretty much altogether unless he's making it a symbolic form on the page itself, because poetry is meant to be heard and read on the page. So it becomes almost a visual painting for E.E. Cummings. It also represents kind of, for E.E. Cummings, I've always seen this as kind of a result, or maybe just emblematic of the chaos of modernity, where the usual strictures don't matter anymore, the usual rules and strictures. And McCarthy does this for a lot of the same reasons. And I think that I actually appreciate this in McCarthy, because I find that, like with the great writers, it's like poetic license. You have to learn the form before you can break it. The best example of that is William Carlos Williams, the poet, who began writing iambic pentameter, kind of late Victorian era sonnets, and then broke into into complete imagism, right? So he said, William Carlos Williams famously said, no ideas but in things. Like, words are not made of ideas, beautiful ideas. They're made of things. They're made of specific parts. It's like form and function meld at the same time that society is building and is engineering and building skyscrapers. So each of the parts of a word or a poem function as a kind of a structure, like a physical structure. And I think that why use apostrophes in some words? I don't know. I'd have to look at a specific passage in terms of deciphering the passage in terms of context, form, and content. But with McCarthy, it kind of an overall statement would be to say, like, let's take something like Blood Meridian. One of the reasons is that the speaker is in the third person. So in a way, you would think that the speaker would write the story or the narrative from the format of the way we all understand the rules. But because the narrative itself, like Blood Meridian, is so otherworldly, and because all the characters are low, except for Judge Holden, who is a high character, it's the same reason that Shakespeare changes from verse form to prose. In other words, like, the low characters are going to speak low, and the grammatical rules are going to be thrown out the window because the characters themselves don't understand the rules, whereas a character like Judge Holden does. Another reason is that it's the same reason that McCarthy writes almost purely. McCarthy and Don DeLeo write almost completely in sentence fragments. I mean, it's really noticeable. And maybe other people don't notice this as much, but it's really noticeable to me. I think probably anybody who reads these books notices this, but they write almost purely in sentence fragments. They're not complete sentences with subjects and predicates. The verb drives the sentence, the action, and then there is the kind of poetic description. But we don't have the adherence to a specific form and a grammatical form like we do in other novels, because the context of the content demands that. In other words, the form and the content work together to produce meaning. And the meaning, especially in McCarthy and Don DeLeo, is one of the broken landscape of literature and society, and the kind of fragmentation of the psychical and spiritual world that they are showing in their worldview, if that makes sense. That was a lot of words. I'm sorry. That was a really good question. I hope I somewhat answered that. But really also what it boils down to is choice. Now the great artists will have to justify their choices in form, but only according to the content. So this is different from, like, let's say when you're in sixth grade and you're writing a story and you don't know the rules, and they don't end up, there's no continuity and there's no unity of purpose because you don't really know the rules and you're just writing for writing. But in the great artists, especially in the canon, this is sort of justified by form and content, if that makes sense. I hope I answered that somewhat. So again, so the next book we're going to do is, great question, Rasky. And if anybody wants to support, please, you can drop a super chat there. You can also drop a donation in PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo. And look at that. We have a big dono from our homeboy out there, Nick, the Green Feathers, TGF, our longtime homeboy and supporter, our good friend out there, Nick, TGF, who drops $40 on PayPal. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Thank you so much. I love you. I love your family. Please say hi to the family. Nick is a hardworking man, a great father, great husband, and a great friend. So really, thank you so much. Appreciate you out there, Nick. Again, thank you also to Jason and to Amy, Shouts out to all of our friends out there. Shouts out also to our homeboy out there, BPF, Andy at the Crucible, who is so supportive. There's a lot that goes on, you guys. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot that goes on with lots of channels, behind the scenes and people, working hard to produce their content. But I got to say that, thanks to Andy, BPF out there at the Crucible, and to Rachel, who have been so kind to me and so helpful in helping me to get this thing going. And, we're friends out there and we're trying to help each other. I don't know how I am helping, but, but they've certainly helped me. So really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And shouts out, of course, as always, to our homeboys, Jay, Tristan, David Patrick Harry, to Jury out there at Exposing Powerful Lies, to Jethro, to Natesky, to Mikhail, to Mixky, Tech Noir Graphics on Instagram. Please follow Tech Noir Graphics on Instagram. Our friend Mick is such a great graphic artist and a hard-working man and a great, great dude. And he's our friend out there, so please follow him. And please follow me on Instagram, too, if you haven't. Shouts out to all the people that support me. Shouts out to Talita out there. We pray for your family, pray for you down there in New Zealand. Shouts out to DJ in Australia. Shouts out to the people who have given me some ideas and who have supported me for sponsored streams. And again, like I said, you will see me coming up on some pretty cool things coming up. And when they get closer, I'll put them on the community tab and I'll let you know, because I think we're doing some pretty cool things. Trying to get this channel. I mean, just, we're just having fun. But trying to get us going and keep on moving on. And again, if you have any ideas for works of literature that you want me to cover, I'll also be covering High Wind in Jamaica, Richard Hughes. I'll be covering, I'm also going to be covering Karamori by Thomas Harris. I think I mentioned that in the last stream. The guy who wrote what's it called? Silence of the Lambs, Mississippi writer. That'll be some deep, disturbing horror. I'm trying to get a copy of Killer Kane from William Peter Blatty. We'll be covering Glamorama by Bret Easton Ellis. This will be our, let's see, we did Lunar Park. I put a link to Lunar Park in the description of this video because a lot of what the speaker in Lunar Park goes through is similar to what Steppenwolf goes through in terms of his quest. But we did Lunar Park, we did American Psycho, we did The Informers. Let's see, we've talked about Less Than Zero a little bit. So this might be our, fourth Bret Easton Ellis. But we'll be covering Glamorama, which has obvious correlations with the Balenciaga thing that's been happening. That's kind of, still going on, but a little bit in the past, and has ties in with Zoolander, of course, because they came to a settlement about that because Zoolander takes a lot from Glamorama, and more books. So if you have an idea for something to cover, then please don't hesitate to drop me an email, madmaximalism2x's@gmail.com. Gmail.com, madmaximalism, 2x's at gmail.com. Mixkey says, I'd love to hear your breakdown of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's interesting, Mick, because just yesterday, I was looking at a big stack of books and thinking about how I meant to cover, or I was going to get started covering One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest back last spring, but I decided not to, because of other stuff we were covering for various reasons. But I would love to do that. So if you guys want to see me do One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I'll do that. I read that book. First time I read that book was in 9th grade. I remember exactly where I was when I read it. I read that in 9th grade. And that book actually ties in a lot with the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe from Richmond went to my school. And I learned this past summer was Tom Wolfe, who wrote Bonfire of the Vanities, The Right Stuff, and Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, was the babysitter for my 7th grade English teacher when he was little. I didn't know that. And I'm not going to say his name, but shouts out to that English teacher because he's the one who, he was the one who he's one of those dudes that influenced me in a huge way. I mean, he really jump-started my love of literature. He's the first one, especially in terms of a school setting. And he's the one who gave me the copy of No One Here Gets Out Alive and Hammer of the Gods, the Led Zeppelin books. And he said, read these, dude. He was just the best. And that was his first year teaching. He just retired. But he also wrote a book himself that he would read from in class called Tar River. I think I told the story of this because he was a track runner at William & Mary. And he wrote a short story about how he learned to control his breathing and he lost to this guy in track meets. And then the guy was controlling his breathing and was behind him. He had passed him, and then the guy was behind him in the track meet. And then the guy passed him in the race and then got run over by a car and decapitated. And his first thought was, I win. Now, that's in the story. That didn't really happen in real life. But his story in his book was really cool. And he also introduced, at least it was interesting. But he also introduced me to a book called The Pugilist at Rest, which was a great short story book. And he's the guy who I think I said, remember, I think I told you guys this once that like I had the 6th grade English teacher and I had a copy of Helter Skelter. And I asked her if I could read it. I don't know why I needed her permission, but I asked her if I could read it. And she said, no, read Treasure Island. So I read Treasure Island and I didn't read that book. And then when I got him in 7th grade, I said, can I read this book? And he said, far out, man, read it. Read it. So I read the 700-page book, Helter Skelter, and I still remember the book. So I reread it again later, but yeah. So anyway, that was that guy. So yeah, so there's a little sort of pointless stories. Anyway, I am going to get back to reading Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and then I'm going to rewatch the film. And then I'm going to read The Glass Menagerie and A Streetcar Named Desire. I hope y'all liked this Herman Hesse Steppenwolf analysis. If you liked it or you enjoyed it, again, drop me an email. Support me anytime. Share the stream. Click the like button. And if nobody has anything else, if y'all don't have anything else, I think that's about it. So I will see y'all later. I love y'all, and yeah, we got to keep living. So thanks, y'all. I appreciate you. I love you, and I will talk to you later. All right, that's all I got.